Some bonds run deeper than blood, and some choices can break a man's heart forever. In the harsh mountains of Wyoming, an aging cowboy named Silas Grant made a decision that would change everything when he found 3 orphaned bear cubs crying in the snow. Against every warning from his neighbors, Silas raised those cubs like his own children on his remote homestead. For years, they were his family, the only family he had left in this world. But when powerful men with mining equipment moved into the valley, everything went wrong. The bears, now massive and dangerous, turned violent when the blasting started. Livestock began dying. The townspeople demanded blood. Now Silas faces the most painful choice of his life. But what would you do if the creatures you loved became the thing everyone feared? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like a promise of rain that never came, and Silas Grant stepped onto his front porch with the kind of measured pace that comes from 63 years of Wyoming winters. His weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee, the ceramic warm against fingers that had known rope burn and cattle brands, fence posts, and the gentle touch needed to birth a foal in the dark hours before dawn. The rocking ranch stretched out before him in all directions, 5,000 acres of rolling grassland bordered by the Bridger Mountains to the north and the Salt River Range to the south. It wasn't the biggest spread in the valley, but it had been home to 3 generations of Grant men, and the iron brand hanging beside his barn door bore witness to that legacy. His father had made that brand by hand in 1892, heating the metal in a forge that still stood in the corner of the barn, gathering dust but holding memories like a sacred trust. Silas took a slow sip of his coffee and let his eyes trace the familiar landscape. The aspen groves were beginning to turn, their leaves catching the early light like scattered coins. Soon they'd be gold as Sarah's hair had been when she was young, before the cancer took the color from her cheeks and the laughter from their home. 5 years now since she'd passed, 5 years of empty conversations with the wind and meals for one at a table built for a family they'd never had. The loneliness sat in his chest most mornings, a weight he'd grown accustomed to carrying. It wasn't self-pity. Silas Grant had never been a man to indulge in such things, but rather a quiet acknowledgement of the space that used to be filled with Sarah's voice, calling him in for breakfast, at her humming while she tended her garden, the soft sound of her breathing beside him in the dark. A red-winged blackbird landed on the porch railing and cocked its head at him with the bold curiosity of a creature that had learned not to fear this particular human. Silas had always been good with animals, better than he was with people if he was being honest. There was something pure in the way a horse responded to gentle hands, the way cattle followed a man who moved with purpose but without haste, the way even the wild things seemed to sense that he meant no harm. "Morning to you too," he said to the blackbird, which ruffled its feathers and took flight toward the creek that wound its way through the heart of his property. The sound of a truck engine rumbling up his drive interrupted the morning quiet, and Silas watched as Doc Henderson's old Ford kicked up a trail of dust on its way to the house. The veterinarian had been making his monthly rounds to check on Silas's stock, but more than that, he'd been the closest thing to a friend Silas had since Sarah died. They'd known each other since childhood, had served together briefly in Vietnam before Doc went off to veterinary school and Silas came home to take over the ranch. "Coffee's hot," Silas called, as Doc climbed out of his truck, medical bag in one hand and a manila envelope in the other. Dr. James Henderson was a tall, lean man with silver hair and the steady hands of someone who'd spent 40 years bringing life into the world and sometimes easing it out. He nodded his appreciation and settled into the wooden chair beside Silas on the porch, accepting the offered cup with a grateful sigh. "Good to see you looking rested," Doc said, studying Silas with the practiced eye of someone who'd been doctoring both animals and their owners for most of his adult life. "How are the nightmares?" Silas shrugged. The dreams had been coming more frequently lately, visions of Sarah in her garden, calling to him from some place he couldn't reach. Sometimes she was young again, sometimes she was, as he'd last seen her, thin and fragile in their bed, with her hand in his. He'd wake with his heart hammering and the taste of regret in his mouth, wondering what he might have done differently. "Same as always," he said, which was Silas's way of saying he didn't want to talk about it. Doc nodded, understanding the language of men who'd learned early that some pain was meant to be carried silently. He lifted the envelope and set it on the small table between their chairs. "Got some news from town that might interest you, or worry you, depending on how you look at it." Silas raised an eyebrow but didn't reach for the envelope. In his experience, news that came in official-looking packages was rarely the kind that improved a man's day. "Blackstone Mining Company," Doc said, as if the name itself explained everything. "They've filed permits with the state to begin mineral surveys in the mountains, looking for copper and silver. From what I hear." The coffee turned bitter in Silas's mouth. He'd heard rumors about mining companies sniffing around the valley, drawn by the promise of metals buried in the ancient rock of the Bridger Mountains. But rumors were one thing, and official permits were another entirely. "How close to my land?" he asked. "Close enough to matter. They're looking at the whole northern range, including some areas that back up to your summer grazing pastures." Silas set his coffee cup down harder than necessary, the ceramic ringing against the wooden table. Mining meant trucks and machinery, noise and dust, men with hard hats and harder attitudes who saw the land as nothing more than a resource to be extracted and consumed. It meant the end of the peace he'd found here, the quiet that had been his salvation since Sarah died. "What's Sheriff Miller saying about all this?" "Tom's in a tough spot. Company's got lawyers and permits, everything legal and above board. But he knows what mining does to a place, knows what it'll mean for folks like you, who've been here all their lives." Doc leaned back in his chair and gazed out at the mountains, their peaks still touched with snow, even in early October. "There's talk of them bringing in their own security, hiring local men to keep an eye on things. Fellow named Jake Morrison's already been asking around town about work." Silas knew Morrison by reputation, a hard man who'd done some hunting and tracking for the county, the kind who saw everything through the scope of a rifle. Not the sort you'd want around if you valued the natural order of things. "Seems like a man ought to be able to live in peace on land. His family's worked for 3 generations, Silas said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated disappointment. "Seems like there should be some things that money can't just take." "Should be," Doc agreed, "but should be and is have never been the same thing, especially when there's profit involved." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the morning light creep across the valley floor and listening to the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. It was the kind of moment that reminded Silas why he'd never wanted to live anywhere else. Why? The thought of strangers trampling through his mountains made his chest tight with something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't far from it either. "There's something else," Doc said eventually, his tone shifting to the careful neutrality he used when delivering news that might be hard to accept. "Martha Wilson asked me to mention that if you ever get lonely up here, there's a standing invitation for Sunday dinner. She's been saying that for months now, and I keep forgetting to pass it along." Martha Wilson was the town librarian, a woman about Silas's age, whose husband had died in a logging accident 7 years earlier. She was kind and intelligent, with the sort of gentle strength that Sarah had possessed, and Silas knew that Doc's suggestion wasn't entirely innocent. But the thought of sitting at another woman's table, of making conversation that didn't come naturally anymore, filled him with a weariness that went deeper than his bones. "I appreciate the thought," Silas said, which was his polite way of declining without having to explain why the idea of moving forward felt like a betrayal of everything he'd lost. Doc nodded again, recognizing the boundaries that grief had drawn around Silas's life. They finished their coffee in the easy quiet of old friends, watching the sun climb higher over the mountains that had sheltered them both for most of their lives. When Doc finally stood to leave, he paused at the steps and turned back to Silas with the kind of expression that meant he had something important to say. Whatever happens with this mining business, you don't have to face it alone. There are people in town who remember what your family's meant to this valley, people who understand that some things are worth fighting for." Silas nodded his thanks, but as he watched Doc's truck disappear down the drive in its familiar cloud of dust, he felt the weight of solitude settling around him like an old coat. He'd been alone for 5 years now, and the idea of asking for help didn't come naturally to a man who'd spent his life taking care of everything and everyone around him. The red-winged blackbird returned to the porch railing, and Silas found himself wondering if it was the same one or just another member of the flock that nested in the willows by the creek. Did it matter? Birds lived their lives according to patterns that hadn't changed in 10,000 years, following instincts that told them when to migrate and when to stay, when to trust and when to flee. Maybe that was wisdom, he thought. Maybe there was something to be learned from creatures that knew their place in the world and didn't spend their time questioning whether they belonged. As the morning wore on and the sun climbed toward its zenith, Silas went about his daily routines with the mechanical precision of a man whose life had been reduced to necessary tasks. He checked on his cattle, mended a section of fence that had been damaged by deer, and spent an hour working on the tractor that had been giving him trouble since spring. The work was familiar and comforting, the kind of labor that kept his hands busy while his mind wandered through memories and possibilities in equal measure. But throughout the day, his thoughts kept returning to Doc's news about the mining company and to the envelope that still sat unopened on his kitchen table. Change was coming to the valley, whether he welcomed it or not, and Silas Grant had lived long enough to know that when powerful men decided they wanted something, they usually found a way to take it. The only question was how much of his world he'd be able to protect when the time came to make a stand. The storm came from the northwest, like the wrath of an angry god, rolling down from the mountains with the kind of fury that reminded a man just how small he was in the grand scheme of things. Silas had been tracking its approach for 2 days, watching the barometer drop and feeling the pressure change in his bones, the way old ranchers do when weather's about to turn mean. By evening, the snow was falling sideways, driven by winds that howled through the valley like the voices of every winter that had ever claimed a life in these mountains. Silas moved through his evening chores with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd weathered dozens of such storms, securing what needed. Securing and making sure his stock had shelter and feed enough to last until it blew over. The power went out just after 9 o'clock, leaving him with the oil lamp that had belonged to his grandfather and the battery-powered radio that crackled with weather warnings and emergency broadcasts. The storm was expected to last through the night and into the next day, with temperatures dropping to 20 below and wind gusts that could knock a man flat. Silas built up the fire in his stone fireplace and settled into Sarah's old rocking chair with a cup of coffee and a book of Robert Frost poems that she'd given him for Christmas the year before she died. He'd never been much of a reader, but there was something about Frost's words that spoke to the parts of him that understood the weight of choices and the roads not taken. Around midnight, the wind seemed to pause for breath, and in that brief moment of relative quiet, Silas heard something that made him set down his book and cock his head toward the window. It wasn't the usual sounds of a storm, the creaking of timber and the rattle of windows, but something else, something that seemed almost human in its distress. He pulled on his heavy coat and boots, grabbed the oil lamp, and stepped out into the maelstrom. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his eyes water instantly. Snow stung his face like thrown sand, and the wind tried to push him back toward the house with invisible hands. But there it was, again a sound that cut through the storm's fury like a blade through cloth. Not human after all, but animal, and young by the sound of it, something in trouble, something that wouldn't last long in weather like this. Silas raised the lamp higher and squinted into the driving snow, following the sound toward the grove of cottonwoods that bordered his property on the east side. The going was treacherous, with drifts already knee-deep and growing deeper by the hour, but he pressed on with the stubborn determination that had carried him through 6 decades of Wyoming winters. He found them huddled against the trunk of the largest cottonwood, 3 balls of dark fur barely visible against the tree's bark. At first, his mind tried to make sense of what he was seeing: puppies, maybe, or bear cubs, though what would either be doing out in weather like this? But as he drew closer and the lamplight fell across them more clearly, there was no mistaking what they were. Grizzly cubs, maybe 4 months old, crying for their mother, with voices that sounded heartbreakingly small in the vastness of the storm. They were covered in snow and ice, shivering so violently that Silas could see it, even through their thick fur. One of them, the largest, tried to stand when the light reached them, but stumbled and fell back against its siblings. Silas raised the lamp higher and swept its light in a wide circle, looking for the mother bear that should have been nearby. What he found instead made his stomach clench with the kind of sorrow that comes from witnessing nature's cruelest moments. She lay 20 feet away, partially buried in snow, but still visible enough to tell the story. A massive sow grizzly, probably 600 pounds in life, lying on her side with her eyes closed and her great head pillowed on her paws. There was no obvious sign of injury, no blood or broken bones that might have explained her death. Sometimes, Silas knew, the old ones just reached the end of their strength, and a storm like this could be the final burden that proved too much to carry. Around her neck was something that caught the lamplight and glinted gold, a collar, old and worn, the kind that researchers sometimes used to track bears. It told a story of a creature that had lived on the margins between wild and human, monitored and studied but never tamed. The cubs cried again, a sound that cut through the storm and straight into the part of Silas's heart that had been empty since Sarah died. They were going to freeze to death out here, orphaned and helpless, in a world that had suddenly become hostile beyond their understanding. Nature could be merciless in its indifference, but it could also offer moments of grace to those willing to recognize them. Silas set the lamp down carefully and approached the cubs slowly, speaking in the gentle tones he'd always used with frightened animals. The largest one, a male, he could see now, raised his head and looked at Silas with dark eyes that held intelligence and fear in equal measure. The other 2, smaller and weaker, barely had the strength to lift their heads. "Easy now," Silas murmured, extending his hand palm down so they could catch his scent. "Easy. I'm not going to hurt you." The big cub sniffed his fingers tentatively, then made a sound that was part whimper, part growl. It was a sound that spoke of confusion and loss, of a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. Silas understood that feeling better than most. He shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around the 3 cubs, lifting them together as gently as he could manage. They were heavier than he'd expected, solid with muscle and bone beneath their fur, but still small enough to carry. The largest one struggled briefly, then seemed to understand that this human meant safety rather than harm. The trip back to the house was a battle against wind and snow that tried to blind him and knock him down with every step. But Silas had been born in these mountains, had learned their moods and their dangers before he could properly walk, and he made it to his front door with his precious cargo intact. Once inside, he carried the cubs to the warmth of the fireplace and set them down on the braided rug that Sarah had made during their first winter together. They huddled close to each other and to the warmth, their breathing shallow but steady. The largest cub, Silas, found himself thinking of him as Bear, for lack of a better name, kept his dark eyes fixed on this strange human who had brought them in from the cold. Silas knew he should call Doc Henderson, should report the dead mother, and ask what the proper procedure was for orphaned wildlife. He knew there were state agencies that dealt with such things, people trained in wildlife management who would know the right thing to do. But as he looked at the 3 small lives that were depending on him for their next breath, the official procedures seemed less important than the immediate need to keep them alive through the night. Tomorrow could take care of itself. Tonight, There were three creatures who needed warmth and food, and the simple presence of something larger than themselves that promised safety. He heated milk on the wood stove and found an old baby bottle that Sarah had bought years ago when they'd still hoped for children of their own. The cubs took to it after some coaxing, their hunger overcoming their fear of this strange new world they'd been thrust into. Bear was the first to drink, then encouraged his smaller siblings. The female Silas decided to call Honey for her lighter coloring, and the smallest male he named Buck for the way he butted his head against everything. As the night wore on and the storm continued to rage outside, Silas found himself settling into a rhythm he'd almost forgotten. The feeding every few hours, the constant vigilance for signs of distress, the tender care that came naturally to anything small and helpless. It reminded him of the early years of his marriage, when he and Sarah had talked about the family they'd have and the children who would run through these rooms. The cubs slept fitfully at first, crying out in their dreams for the mother who would never come. But gradually, as the warmth of the fire and the steadiness of Silas's presence worked their magic, they began to relax into deeper rest. Bear positioned himself between his siblings and the room, already taking on the protective instincts that would serve him well if he lived to adulthood. Sometime before dawn, when the worst of the storm had passed and the wind had settled into a steady whisper rather than a howl, Silas realized that he'd made a decision without consciously making it. These cubs were going to live, and he was going to make sure of it, regardless of what the law or common sense or the neighbors might have to say about it. He looked at the three small forms sleeping peacefully by his fire and felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 long years, the sense that he was needed, that his life had purpose beyond the simple maintenance of routine. They would need him completely, these orphaned bears, at least until they were old enough to choose their own path in the world. It was a responsibility that both thrilled and terrified him, but as Bear opened one dark eye and looked at him with something that might have been trust, Silas knew there was no turning back. The storm passed with the coming of dawn, leaving the world outside clean and white and silent. But inside the warm circle of his home, Silas Grant had found something he'd thought was lost forever, a reason to believe that love could still take root in the hardest ground, and that sometimes the most important families were the ones you never expected to have. The first week nearly broke him. Silas had raised cattle and horses, had helped birth everything from foals to calves to the occasional difficult lamb, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the relentless demands of 3 orphaned grizzly cubs. They needed feeding every 3 hours, day and night, and their digestive systems were delicate enough that the wrong formula or too much milk could mean the difference between life and death. He moved Sarah's old rocking chair from the living room to the kitchen, positioning it near the wood stove where the warmth was most consistent. It was in that chair that he spent the longest nights of his adult life, with one cub or another cradled against his chest, while he coaxed them to take nourishment from the bottles he'd fashioned from baby supplies. Doc Henderson had quietly procured from town. Doc had arrived the morning after the storm, expecting to find Silas weathering another solitary winter, and instead discovered him sitting on his kitchen floor with 3 bear cubs climbing over him like he was their personal mountain. The veterinarian's face had gone through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, concern, and something that might have been admiration. "Well," Doc had said after a long pause, setting down his medical bag and removing his coat with the deliberate movements of someone buying time to think. "This is either the best thing that's happened to you in years, or it's going to get you killed." "Might be both," Silas had replied, gently untangling Honey's claws from his shirt sleeve. "But they needed help, and I was here." Doc had examined each cub with the thoroughness he brought to all his patients, checking their eyes and ears, listening to their hearts, and pronouncing them remarkably healthy, considering their ordeal. He'd also provided Silas with proper milk replacer formulated for wild mammals, antibiotics in case of infection, and a long list of warnings about what he was getting himself into. Bears aren't dogs, Silas. They're not meant to live with humans, no matter how young they start. What you're doing here is kind-hearted, but it's also dangerous as hell. And when word gets out, and it will, you're going to have every wildlife official and concerned citizen in 3 counties beating down your door. Silas had nodded his understanding, but his hands had remained gentle on Bear's fur as the cub dozed in his lap. The big male had already shown himself to be the leader of the small family, the first to investigate new sounds or smells, the first to come to his siblings' defense when they cried. He reminded Silas of himself at that age, serious beyond his years, carrying responsibilities that should have belonged to someone older. "I'll cross that bridge when I come to it," Silas had said. "Right now, they need what I can give them." Over the following days, he learned the rhythm of their needs and began to understand their individual personalities. Bear was indeed the protector, but he was also the most curious, the first to explore the corners of the kitchen, and the first to figure out that the warm spot by the stove was the best place for morning naps. Honey was the gentle one, content to curl up in Silas's lap for hours at a time, purring in the way that only very young bears could. Buck was the comedian, the one who tumbled over his own paws and seemed to find everything in the world endlessly fascinating. Silas cleared out a corner of his barn and built them a proper den. Insulated with straw and heated by a space heater, he ran off the generator. It was there that they spent their days when the weather was too harsh for outdoor play, wrestling with each other and with the old saddle blankets Silas had provided for their entertainment. But at night, when the temperature dropped and the wind howled through the valley, they slept inside by the fireplace, curled together in a heap of fur and contentment. The feeding routine was the most demanding part. Cubs this young needed to eat every few hours, and their stomachs were sensitive to changes in temperature or formula consistency. Silas learned to warm the milk to exactly the right temperature, to hold each cub at precisely the right angle, to recognize the subtle signs that meant they'd had enough or needed to be burped or were coming down with the kind of minor illness that could turn serious without proper attention. His own sleep became fragmented, measured in 2 or 3 hour stretches between feedings. He'd doze in the rocking chair with one cub or another in his arms, waking at the first sound of distress from the makeshift den he'd created in the corner of the kitchen. Sometimes he'd find himself standing in the middle of the room at 2 in the morning, swaying gently back and forth, with Honey pressed against his shoulder, humming the lullabies that Sarah used to sing when she thought no one was listening. The cubs grew visibly stronger each day, their coats becoming fuller and more lustrous, their eyes brighter and more alert. Bear began to show the confident swagger that would mark him as an alpha, while Buck developed a mischievous streak that frequently led to overturned water bowls and shredded dish towels. Honey remained the sweetest-natured of the 3, but she was also proving to be the most intelligent, the quickest to learn the routines that governed their small world. By the end of the first week, they had learned to recognize his footsteps and would gather at whatever barrier he'd erected to keep them contained, standing on their hind legs and making the soft huffing sounds that served as their greeting. It was a sound that never failed to make Silas smile, a reminder that despite their wild nature, they had accepted him as something close to family. The first real test of their bond came on a Tuesday morning, when Honey developed what appeared to be a mild respiratory infection. She was listless and warm to the touch, refusing the bottle and spending most of her time sleeping, curled up as close to the space heater as she could manage. Silas called Doc Henderson, who made the drive out to the ranch without being asked. "It's not uncommon," Doc explained after examining the little female. "Young mammals of all kinds are susceptible to respiratory issues, especially when they've been stressed. We'll start her on antibiotics and keep her warm and hydrated. Most important thing is to not let her get dehydrated." For 3 days, Silas hardly left Honey's side. He administered medicine with an eyedropper, coaxed her to take small amounts of water, and held her against his chest so she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Bear and Buck seemed to understand that their sister was ill, staying close to her and offering their own form of comfort by sleeping pressed against her sides. On the fourth day, Honey's fever broke, and she managed to finish an entire bottle of formula. The relief Silas felt was so profound that he had to step outside for a moment to compose himself, standing in the cold morning air and marveling at how completely these three small lives had come to occupy his world. That evening, as he sat in Sarah's rocking chair, with all three cubs piled around him in various states of sleepiness, Silas found himself thinking about the future for the first time since Sarah's death. These bears would grow, would become too large and too strong for the house, would need space and freedom that his ranch could provide, but his home could not. The day would come when he'd have to make decisions about their welfare that might break his heart. But for now, in the warm circle of lamplight, with three trusting creatures depending on him for everything they needed to survive, Silas Grant felt something he'd almost forgotten existed, the deep satisfaction that comes from being needed, from having a purpose that extends beyond oneself. Outside, the winter wind swept down from the mountains with its familiar song of isolation and endurance. But inside, where the fire crackled and the cubs slept peacefully, there was warmth and contentment and the kind of love that grows slowly but roots deeply in the fertile ground of shared need and mutual trust. Bear opened one dark eye and looked up at Silas with an expression that seemed to hold both gratitude and promise. In 6 months, he would be strong enough to defend himself against most threats. In a year, he would be a formidable predator in his own right. But for now, he was simply a small creature who had learned to trust in the kindness of one weathered man who had forgotten that his heart was still capable of expanding to accommodate love. Silas reached down and scratched behind Bear's ears, earning a contented rumble that vibrated through the cub's entire body. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons in the complex art of raising wild things. But tonight was perfect exactly as it was, and that was enough. Spring came early that year, melting the snowpack faster than usual and turning the creek that ran through Silas's property into a rushing torrent of snowmelt and mountain rain. The cubs were 5 months old now, still small enough to curl up together in the evening, but growing stronger and more adventurous with each passing day. It was Bear who first discovered the creek, following the sound of running water with the focused intensity that would characterize him throughout his life. Silas found him standing at the water's edge, transfixed by the sight and sound of the current, his head cocked at an angle that suggested deep thought. "That's how it's done, isn't it?" Silas said, settling onto the bank beside the young bear. "Your mama would have taught you about water, about fishing and swimming, and all the things a bear needs to know." Bear looked up at him with those dark, intelligent eyes, then back at the creek, as if trying to puzzle out some mystery written in its depths. Honey and Buck arrived moments later, drawn by curiosity and their unwillingness to be separated from their brother for very long. Soon, all three cubs were standing in the shallows, their paws sending up small splashes as they tested this new element. Silas had been spending his evenings whittling simple toys for them, smooth wooden balls that they could chase and bat around, carved fish that bore only a passing resemblance to the real thing, and sticks shaped into interesting curves that challenged their growing dexterity. The work reminded him of the toys he'd planned to make for the children he and Sarah had never had. But there was comfort in the familiar motion of his knife against the wood, in the satisfaction of creating something that brought joy to creatures who had so little. The cubs loved their wooden toys, carrying them around the ranch and incorporating them into elaborate games that seemed to change rules by the hour. Buck was particularly fond of the carved fish, treating it as both a treasured possession and a worthy opponent in wrestling matches that usually ended with him flat on his back, the wooden fish clutched triumphantly to his chest. As they grew stronger and more coordinated, Silas began taking them on longer walks around his property, teaching them the boundaries of their world and showing them the places where water collected, where the best berry bushes grew, and where they might find the grubs and insects that would become important parts of their diet as they matured. It was during one of these educational outings that they encountered their first serious visitor since Doc Henderson's regular check-ins. Martha Wilson's voice called out from the direction of the house, just as Silas was showing the cubs how to turn over logs to find insects underneath. "Silas, are you out there?" He called back, gathering the cubs with the same gentle authority he'd use with any domestic animal, and led them back toward the house. Martha stood on his front porch, a covered dish in her hands and an expression of careful neutrality on her face that didn't quite hide her curiosity. The librarian was a handsome woman in the way that people of their generation understood the word, not flashy or dramatic, but possessed of the kind of steady attractiveness that improved with acquaintance. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore the sort of sensible clothing that marked her as someone who understood the demands of rural living. "I brought you a casserole," she said, her eyes tracking the movement of the three cubs as they positioned themselves slightly behind Silas. "James mentioned you might be going through a busy patch." Silas appreciated Doc's discretion in not revealing exactly what kind of busy patch he was navigating. "That's very kind of you, Martha. Would you like to come in for coffee?" She hesitated, clearly torn between curiosity and the social conditioning that suggested a single woman shouldn't spend too much time at a bachelor's house without proper supervision. But her natural warmth won out over convention, and she nodded her acceptance. The cubs followed them inside with the casual confidence of creatures who considered the house their rightful domain. Martha's composure held admirably until Honey decided to investigate this newcomer by standing on her hind legs and placing her front paws on the librarian's knees, looking up at her with the kind of direct gaze that demanded attention. "Oh my," Martha said softly, her hand instinctively moving to stroke the cub's head. "They're beautiful, Silas, and much larger than I expected." "Growing fast," Silas agreed, gently encouraging Honey to return to all fours. "Coffee's fresh, if you don't mind drinking it in interesting company." They settled at his kitchen table, the cubs arranging themselves around the room with the casual ownership of long-time residents. Bear claimed his favorite spot by the wood stove, while Buck began a systematic investigation of Martha's purse, which she'd set on the floor beside her chair. Honey, ever the diplomat, positioned herself between Silas and their guest, keeping watchful eyes on both. "James told me about the storm," Martha said carefully, wrapping her hands around the warm coffee mug. "About what you found. It must have been quite a decision." Silas nodded, recognizing the delicate way she was approaching a subject that could be controversial. Didn't feel much like a decision at the time, more like something that just needed doing. "And now?" He looked around the kitchen, that had been transformed from a lonely man's eating place into something that buzzed with life and purpose. The cubs had their toys scattered in corners, their food and water bowls arranged near the stove, their presence woven so thoroughly into the fabric of his daily routine that he could barely remember what the house had felt like before they arrived. "Now it feels like the best decision I've made in years," he said honestly. Martha smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression he'd seen from her since she arrived. "I can see why. They obviously adore you. But Silas, people in town are starting to talk. Not badly," she added quickly, "but there are concerns about safety, about what happens when they get bigger." "They're not going to hurt anyone," Silas said, perhaps more sharply than he'd intended. "They're not aggressive animals. They're just young creatures who needed help." "I know that, but not everyone will see it that way, especially if there are any incidents. And the state wildlife people haven't come around yet," Silas finished. "When they do, I'll deal with it." Buck chose that moment to successfully extract something interesting from Martha's purse, a packet of mints that he began to examine with the intense focus of a scientist studying a new species. Martha laughed despite herself, reaching down to gently retrieve her property. "He's quite the little investigator, isn't he? Gets into everything," Silas agreed, and the fondness in his voice was unmistakable. "All three of them have their own personalities. Bear there is the serious one, the protector. Honey's the sweetest-natured creature you'll ever meet, and Buck is pure mischief with fur. They talked for another hour, Martha sharing news from town, while the cubs gradually warmed to her presence. By the time she rose to leave, Honey was sleeping curled against her feet, and even Bear had approached close enough to accept a gentle scratch behind the ears. "Thank you for the casserole," Silas said as he walked her to her car. "And for not thinking I've lost my mind." "Oh, I think you might have lost your mind," Martha replied, with a smile that took the sting out of her words. "But sometimes that's exactly what a person needs to do. Just be careful, Silas. There are forces at work in this valley that might not be as understanding as I am." As her car disappeared down the drive, Silas found himself thinking about her warning. He'd been so focused on the day-to-day reality of caring for the cubs that he'd given little thought to the larger implications of what he was doing. But Martha was right. Sooner or later, the outside world would take notice, and when it did, his peaceful sanctuary might become the center of unwanted attention. That evening, as he sat on his porch watching the cubs play in the growing dusk, Silas made a mental inventory of the changes that had occurred in his life over the past 5 months. His days were fuller now, structured around the needs of 3 growing bears, rather than the empty routines of a man trying to fill time until it was decent to go to bed. His sleep was better too, despite the occasional midnight feeding, the kind of deep, dreamless rest that comes from physical and emotional exhaustion rather than the fitful dozing that had characterized the years since Sarah's death. Most importantly, the crushing loneliness that had been his constant companion had lifted, replaced by the constant awareness of being needed and wanted by creatures who depended on him completely. It was a different kind of love than what he'd shared with Sarah, but it was love nonetheless, and it had awakened parts of his heart that he'd thought were permanently closed. Bear approached the porch steps and looked up at Silas with an expression that seemed to contain both question and invitation. The cub was growing confident in his relationship with his human parent, secure enough to initiate contact rather than simply accepting it. Silas reached down and lifted him onto the porch, where Bear settled beside his chair with a contented sigh. "What do you think, big fellow?" Silas asked quietly. "Think we can make this work?" Bear's response was to rest his massive head on Silas's boot, a gesture of trust and affection that spoke louder than words. In the distance, Honey and Buck continued their evening game of chase, their playful growls and tumbling bodies a soundtrack to the peaceful end of another day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did. The cubs were growing stronger and more independent, would soon be too large for many of their current accommodations. There would be decisions to make about their future, conversations to have with officials who might not understand the bond that had formed between an old cowboy and 3 orphaned bears. But tonight, watching his unlikely family play in the last light of day, Silas Grant felt a contentment that had been missing from his life for longer than he cared to remember. Whatever the future held, these months of raising 3 bear cubs had reminded him that love could take root in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most important families were the ones that chose each other against all odds and reason. 1 year later, the cubs had become bears in every sense except experience. Bear now stood 4 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed close to 300 pounds, his coat thick and dark with the promise of the massive creature he would become. Honey had grown into a graceful female with intelligent eyes and a temperament that remained gentle despite her increasing size and strength. Buck, the smallest of the 3, had compensated for his stature with an abundance of curiosity and a fearless approach to life that sometimes worried Silas more than he cared to admit. The mining company's presence in the valley had grown more visible over the summer months, with survey teams appearing regularly in the foothills and the distant sound of machinery echoing across the landscape on still mornings. Silas had watched their progress with growing unease, noting how the wildlife patterns had begun to shift in response to the increased human activity. It was on a crisp October morning that the first representatives from Blackstone Mining Company paid him a visit. Two men, in expensive suits and clean boots, walked up his drive, with the confidence of people accustomed to getting what they wanted through a combination of charm and financial pressure. Mr. Grant? The older of the two, a silver-haired man with the kind of artificial smile that came standard with corporate training, extended his hand. "I'm Richard Blackstone, CEO of Blackstone Mining. This is my operations manager, Frank Walsh. We were hoping we could have a few minutes of your time to discuss some exciting opportunities for the valley." Silas shook their hands with the polite reserve that mountain people displayed toward strangers, particularly strangers who arrived unannounced with business propositions. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" "We're conducting mineral surveys in the region," Walsh explained, consulting a folder thick with maps and documents. "Preliminary results suggest significant copper and silver deposits in the mountains adjacent to your property. We'd like to discuss the possibility of expanding our operations to include some of your land." "Land's not for sale," Silas said simply. Blackstone's smile never wavered. "Oh, we're not necessarily talking about purchasing, Mr. Grant. We're prepared to offer very generous lease agreements that would allow you to maintain ownership while providing you with substantial income from our mining activities." Many landowners in similar situations have found these arrangements quite profitable. From somewhere behind the barn came the sound of splintering wood, followed by Buck's distinctive huffing laugh. Silas excused himself and walked around the building to find that the young bear had managed to demolish the corner of an old shed in his ongoing investigation of interesting smells and textures. "Buck," Silas said with the patient exasperation of a parent whose child had just tracked mud through a clean house, "what did I tell you about the outbuildings?" The bear looked up from his destruction with an expression of such complete innocence that Silas almost smiled despite himself. In the distance, Bear and Honey emerged from the tree line where they'd been foraging, alerted by the sound of their human's voice. When Silas returned to his visitors, he found them staring in the direction of the approaching bears, with expressions that had shifted from professional confidence to something approaching alarm. "Those are," Walsh began. "Grizzly bears," Silas confirmed. "Bear, Honey, and Buck. I raised them from cubs." The two men exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their opinion of ranchers who kept dangerous wildlife as pets. Blackstone recovered first, his corporate composure reasserting itself with visible effort. "That's quite remarkable, Mr. Grant, though I have to say, having large predators on your property might complicate any potential mining operations. Safety regulations are quite strict about such things." "Wouldn't be a problem," Silas replied, "since there aren't going to be any mining operations on my land." "Perhaps you should take some time to consider our offer," Walsh suggested, pulling a business card from his jacket. "The financial benefits could be substantial, and we're prepared to work around any existing obstacles." After the men left, Silas found himself studying the maps they'd shown him, noting how the proposed mining areas surrounded his property on three sides. It didn't take a genius to recognize the strategy, pressure him from multiple directions until he felt he had no choice but to cooperate or sell. That evening, Doc Henderson stopped by for his monthly check on Silas and the bears, finding his old friend sitting on the porch, with Bear lounging at his feet like an enormous dog. The veterinarian had grown accustomed to the unusual sight over the past year, but he still approached with the cautious respect that any sensible person showed around wild predators. "How are they adapting to the shorter days?" Doc asked, settling into the chair beside Silas. "Getting restless. Bear especially. I think he's starting to feel the pull of the wild spaces, the need to establish his own territory." Silas scratched behind the big male's ears, earning a rumble of contentment. "Can't say I blame him. This place is getting a little crowded for creatures his size. Any thoughts about what you'll do when they're fully grown?" It was a question Silas had been avoiding, even in his own mind. The bears were already too large for the house, too strong for casual handling, too wild at heart to remain content with domestic life indefinitely. But the thought of simply releasing them into the mountains felt like abandonment, a betrayal of the trust they'd placed in him since their first night by his fireplace. "Cross that bridge when I come to it," he said, which was his standard response to problems he wasn't ready to solve. "Might be coming sooner than you think. Had a visit from Jake Morrison today. He's been asking around town about permits for predator control, specifically mentioning concerns about bears that have lost their natural fear of humans." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. Jake Morrison was exactly the kind of man who would see bear, honey, and buck as problems to be eliminated rather than intelligent creatures with their own right to exist. What kind of concerns? General ones, mostly. But he's been talking to some of the ranchers whose property borders yours, asking about livestock safety and insurance liability, creating the impression that it's only a matter of time before there's an incident. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Morrison's truck appeared at the end of Silas's drive, moving slowly as the hunter surveyed the property with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating potential targets. He didn't stop or wave, but his message was clear enough. He was watching, waiting for an excuse to take action. "He's working for someone," Silas said, recognizing the signs of a man following orders rather than personal conviction. "Mining company, maybe, or someone else who'd benefit from my bears being gone." Doc nodded grimly. "That would be my guess. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before Silas could answer, Buck came bounding around the corner of the house in pursuit of something only he could see, his massive form moving with surprising grace for such a large animal. He skidded to a halt when he saw Doc, approaching with the cautious friendliness he showed toward visitors he recognized as safe. "Hello, Buck," Doc said, extending his hand for the bear to sniff. "Still getting into trouble, I see." Buck responded by sitting down and offering his paw in the gesture. Silas had taught him as a cub, a trick that never failed to amaze visitors despite the fact that it was performed by a creature who could easily remove a man's arm if he chose to do so. "He's a good bear," Silas said quietly. "They all are. Never shown a moment of real aggression toward a human being. But people see what they expect to see, and what they expect to see is dangerous predators who can't be trusted." "Maybe it's time to consider other options," Doc suggested gently. "There are wildlife preserves, places where they could live more natural lives while still being protected from hunters and development." "Maybe," Silas agreed, though the word tasted bitter in his mouth. "But not yet. They're still young enough to need guidance, still learning what it means to be bears instead of oversized pets. Another year or two, perhaps." Doc didn't argue, understanding that Silas was fighting against more than just practical considerations. These bears had become his family in all the ways that mattered, and asking him to give them up was like asking him to tear out a piece of his own heart. As the evening deepened and Doc prepared to leave, Honey and Bear emerged from wherever they'd been exploring, drawn by the familiar sounds of human conversation. They approached the porch with the confidence of creatures who knew they belonged here, settling into their accustomed places around Silas with the contentment of a family gathering at the end of a long day. "Whatever you decide," Doc said as he climbed into his truck, "don't wait too long. Men like Morrison don't make idle threats, and companies like Blackstone don't take no for an answer easily." Silas nodded his understanding, but as he watched the veterinarian's taillights disappear into the darkness, he found himself thinking not about the dangers that lay ahead, but about the quiet perfection of this moment. Sitting on his porch with three magnificent creatures who trusted him completely, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of a valley that had been his home for 64 years. Change was coming whether he welcomed it or not. But tonight, there was still peace to be found in the simple act of watching over the family he'd never expected to have, in the knowledge that love could take root in the most unlikely soil and flourish despite all the forces arrayed against it. The first explosion came at dawn on a Tuesday in November, a sharp crack that echoed across the valley like thunder from a cloudless sky. Silas felt it as much as heard it, a percussion that seemed to originate in his bones and radiate outward through his chest. He was in the barn feeding his horses when the sound hit, and he watched as every animal on his property went rigid with alarm. The bear's reaction was immediate and visceral. Bear, who had been dozing in his favorite spot near the water trough, leaped to his feet with a roar that spoke of primal fear rather than aggression. Honey and Buck came running from different parts of the property, converging on Silas with wide eyes and laid-back ears, seeking reassurance from the human they'd learned to trust above all else. "Easy," Silas murmured, extending his hands so they could catch his scent and be reassured by his calm presence. "Easy now, just noise, just men making noise in the mountains." But even as he spoke the soothing words, Silas felt his own heart racing with a mixture of anger and apprehension. The mining company had begun their test blasting, turning the peaceful mountains that had sheltered his family for generations into an industrial zone of noise and destruction. Over the following weeks, the explosions became a regular feature of life in the valley, arriving at unpredictable intervals throughout the day and sometimes well into the evening hours. Each blast sent tremors through the ground and filled the air with the acrid smell of cordite and pulverized rock. The wildlife responded, as wildlife always did to such intrusions, by fleeing to quieter territories or, when flight wasn't possible, by becoming increasingly stressed and unpredictable. The bears, having no option to flee from what they considered their home territory, grew more agitated with each passing day. They stayed closer to Silas, following him through his daily routines with the nervous attention of creatures who had lost faith in the stability of their world. Bear developed a habit of positioning himself between Silas and the direction of the mountains, as if his bulk could shield his human from whatever invisible threat was generating the terrible sounds. It was Martha Wilson who brought word of the first real trouble, arriving at Silas's ranch on a grey December afternoon, with worry written clearly across her features. She found him in the barn, working on a bridle while the three bears dozed nearby in the warmth generated by the horses. "There was an incident this morning," she said without preamble, settling onto a hay bale where she could keep all three bears in her line of sight. "The Hendricks family, their sheep." Silas's hands stilled on the leather he'd been mending. The Hendricks ranch bordered his property to the east, good people who'd been working the land almost as long as his own family. How bad? 7 ewes dead, torn up pretty badly, from what Tom Miller told me. Jake Morrison was out there within an hour, taking pictures and measuring tracks. He's claiming it was your bears. The words hit Silas like a physical blow. He'd always known this day might come, had tried to prepare himself for the possibility that his bears might eventually act on instincts that millions of years of evolution had bred into their bones. But knowing something intellectually and facing it emotionally were two entirely different things. "Any proof it was them?" Morrison says the tracks are consistent with the size of your bears. But Silas, Tom Miller, isn't convinced. He's been around predator kills long enough to know what they look like, and he says something about this one doesn't sit right. "What do you mean?" Martha shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the three bears who continued to sleep peacefully, despite the conversation about their alleged crimes. "The sheep were killed, but they weren't eaten. Not even partially. What predator kills 7 animals and doesn't consume any of them? And the tracks Morrison found were only in one small area, like someone had made sure they'd be visible." Silas felt a spark of hope mixed with growing anger. If Martha was right, if the scene had been staged to implicate his bears, then someone was playing a dangerous game with their lives. "Where are Bear, Honey, and Buck right now?" Martha asked. "Been with me all morning, haven't left the ranch since the day before yesterday." Silas looked at his sleeping bears with a mixture of protectiveness and pride. "They don't wander the way they used to, not since the blasting started. Seems to have made them want to stay close to home." "That's what I was hoping you'd say, because Morrison is organizing a hunting party. Says the bears have developed a taste for livestock and need to be eliminated before someone gets hurt." The rage that swept through Silas was cold and calculating, the kind of anger that came from watching innocent creatures threatened by men who couldn't be bothered to learn the truth before passing judgment. His bears had never shown aggression toward livestock, had never displayed anything but the gentle curiosity of well-socialized animals encountering the world beyond their immediate family. When? Tomorrow morning, if Morrison gets his way. But Tom Miller is insisting on a full investigation first. He's bought you some time, but not much. That evening, Silas sat in Sarah's old rocking chair with her wedding ring in his palm, the simple gold band catching the firelight as he turned it slowly between his fingers. He'd kept it in his dresser drawer since her death, taking it out occasionally when the loneliness became too much to bear, and he needed something tangible to remind him of what love felt like. The bears sensed his distress and arranged themselves around his chair in a protective circle, their presence both comforting and heartbreaking. Bear rested his massive head on Silas's knee, brown eyes fixed on his human's face, with an expression of concern that was unmistakably real, despite what skeptics might say about anthropomorphizing animal behavior. "What am I supposed to do with you three?" Silas asked quietly, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated love and impending loss. "How do I keep you safe when the whole world seems determined to see you as monsters?" Honey approached his chair and stood on her hind legs, placing her front paws gently on his arm in the gesture of comfort she'd been offering since cubhood. Buck, not to be outdone, began a soft, huffing sound that was his version of purring, a noise that never failed to bring a smile to Silas's face, even in the darkest moments. The solution, when it came to him, felt both inevitable and impossible. There were places in the deep wilderness, protected areas where bears could live free from human interference, where they could find mates and raise cubs of their own without fear of hunters or mining companies or anyone else who might threaten their existence. He'd been avoiding the idea for months, unwilling to face the reality of separation from the creatures who had become his family. But love, Silas had learned during his years with Sarah, sometimes meant making the hardest choices for the sake of those you cared about most. His bears deserved more than life as refugees in their own territory, more than the constant threat of elimination by men who feared what they didn't understand. Hidden among Sarah's belongings, he remembered, was something that might offer hope, an old map drawn by her grandfather, who had worked as a guide for hunters and naturalists in the early days of the 20th century. It showed trails through the mountains that most modern maps had forgotten, paths that led to remote valleys where the ancient rhythms of the wilderness continued undisturbed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats to the family he'd raised, from orphaned cubs to magnificent adult bears. But tonight, surrounded by their warm presence and the steady crackle of the fire, Silas Grant made the hardest decision of his life and began planning the journey that would either save his bears or cost him everything he had left to lose. The wedding ring grew warm in his palm as he held it, and for just a moment he could almost hear Sarah's voice whispering the words she'd spoken so often during their years together. "Love isn't about holding on, Silas. It's about knowing when to let go." The town meeting was held in the old church basement, the only space large enough to accommodate the crowd that had gathered on a cold Thursday evening in December. Silas arrived deliberately late, hoping to avoid the kind of preliminary conversations that would force him to defend his bears before he'd even had a chance to present his case. He found Martha Wilson near the back of the room, her face tense with the kind of worry that comes from knowing more than you can safely reveal. She nodded toward an empty chair beside her, and Silas settled into it just as Sheriff Miller called the meeting to order. "We're here to discuss the livestock attacks that occurred earlier this week," Miller began, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man trying to maintain peace in a divided community. "Before we make any decisions about how to handle the situation, I want everyone to hear all the facts." Jake Morrison stood from his seat in the front row, a folder thick with photographs and documentation in his hands. He was a lean man in his 40s, with the kind of weathered appearance that came from spending most of his adult life outdoors, hunting and tracking for anyone willing to pay his fees. His reputation was built on efficiency and results, and he'd never been particularly concerned with the ethics of how those results were achieved. "The facts are simple enough," Morrison said, spreading photos across the table at the front of the room. 7 sheep killed on the Hendricks property, all showing the classic signs of bear predation. Massive claw marks, bite patterns consistent with grizzly dentition, and tracks that match the size and spacing of the bears currently residing on the Grant Ranch. Silas felt the weight of eyes turning toward him, some sympathetic, others openly hostile. He'd known this moment would come eventually, had tried to prepare himself for the accusations and demands that would follow. But hearing his bears described in clinical terms as livestock killers still felt like a knife between his ribs. "Furthermore," Morrison continued, "these bears have lost their natural fear of humans through prolonged contact with Mr. Grant. This makes them significantly more dangerous than wild bears, more likely to approach human settlements and see domestic animals as easy prey." "That's not true," Silas said, standing slowly and feeling every one of his 64 years in the effort. "My bears have never shown aggression toward livestock or humans. They're well-socialized animals who've been raised with proper boundaries and respect for—" "With respect, Mr. Grant," Morrison interrupted, "your emotional attachment to these animals is understandable, but it's also clouding your judgment. Grizzly bears are apex predators. It's not a matter of if they'll attack, but when." The room erupted in competing voices, some supporting Morrison's position, others defending Silas's right to maintain his unusual family. Through the chaos, Silas noticed Martha Wilson slipping out the back door, her purse clutched tightly against her chest. Sheriff Miller restored order with the patience of a man who'd been mediating community disputes for 30 years. "Let's keep this civil, people. Jake, you said you found evidence at the scene. Can you walk us through exactly what you discovered?" Morrison opened his folder and extracted a series of photographs that showed the aftermath of the sheep killings. Even from his position at the back of the room, Silas could see the savage nature of the attack, the torn wool and scattered remains that spoke of violence without purpose. "The tracks were clear in the mud near the water source," Morrison explained, pointing to close-up photos of paw prints. "Front paw measuring 11 inches, rear paw 13 inches, consistent with a male grizzly in the 400-pound range. The spacing between prints indicates an animal of significant size, moving at moderate speed." Something in Morrison's presentation nagged at Silas, some detail that didn't align with his knowledge of how his bears moved and behaved. But before he could identify what was bothering him, Martha Wilson reappeared at the back of the room, her face flushed from the cold and her eyes bright with excitement. She made her way to Silas's side and leaned close to whisper in his ear. "I found something you need to see. Jake Morrison's truck. There's mud on his boots, and it matches the soil from the Hendricks property. But more importantly, there's blood on his spare tire and what looks like sheep's wool caught in his front bumper." The implications hit Silas like a physical blow. Morrison hadn't just investigated the scene, he'd created it, killing the sheep himself and then fabricating evidence to implicate the bears. But why? What could he possibly gain from framing 3 animals who posed no real threat to anyone? "There's more," Martha continued, pressing a small notebook into his hands. "This fell out of his truck when he was getting his folder. Take a look at the first page." Silas opened the notebook carefully, mindful of the eyes that were still focused on Morrison's presentation. The first entry was written in Morrison's neat handwriting and dated 3 weeks earlier. "Blackstone payment authorized upon elimination of Grant bears. Staging to look like livestock predation essential for community support." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The mining company wanted his land, and his bears were the obstacle preventing them from achieving their goal. By creating the illusion that the bears were dangerous livestock killers, they could manipulate the community into demanding their elimination, leaving Silas isolated and vulnerable to increased pressure to sell. The question before us tonight, Morrison was saying, is not whether these bears pose a threat, but how quickly we can organize a response before someone gets killed. Silas stood again, the notebook clutched in his hand like evidence of a crime that went far deeper than sheep killing. Before we go any further, I think everyone needs to see something. He made his way to the front of the room, aware of the murmur of voices that followed his movement. Sheriff Miller looked at him with curiosity, while Morrison's expression shifted to something approaching alarm. "This notebook belongs to Mr. Morrison," Silas said, holding it up for everyone to see. "It contains evidence that the sheep killings were staged to frame my bears and justify their elimination." Morrison lunged forward, trying to snatch the notebook from Silas's hands. "That's private property. You have no right." "Tom," Silas said, turning to Sheriff Miller and ignoring Morrison's protests, "I think you need to read the first entry." The sheriff took the notebook and read silently, his face growing darker with each word. When he finished, he looked up at Morrison with the kind of expression that suggested a long-standing professional relationship was about to come to an abrupt end. "Jake Morrison, you're under arrest for destruction of property and conspiracy to commit fraud. You have the right to remain silent." The room exploded into chaos as Morrison tried to flee and was tackled by two ranchers who'd positioned themselves near the door. In the confusion that followed, Silas found himself surrounded by neighbors offering apologies and support, their anger now directed toward the man who'd manipulated them into threatening innocent animals. But even as justice was being served, Silas felt no satisfaction in Morrison's downfall. The hunter had been a tool, nothing more, hired by people with deeper pockets and longer reach than one unemployed predator specialist. The real threat to his bears came from corporate boardrooms and legal departments, from people who viewed the natural world as an obstacle to be removed rather than a treasure to be preserved. Martha Wilson appeared at his elbow as the crowd began to disperse, her hand finding his arm with the gentle pressure of shared triumph. "It's a start," she said quietly, "but you know this isn't over." Silas nodded, thinking of the maps hidden in Sarah's belongings, of the remote valleys where his bears might find the freedom they deserved. Morrison's arrest would buy him time, but it wouldn't change the fundamental equation that threatened his family's existence. "No," he agreed, looking out the church windows toward the mountains, where his bears waited for his return. "It's not over. But maybe now we have a fighting chance." The drive home was quiet, the truck's headlights cutting through darkness that seemed less oppressive than it had just hours earlier. When Silas pulled into his driveway, he found all three bears waiting on the front porch, their dark forms silhouetted against the warm light spilling from his kitchen windows. They greeted him with the enthusiastic affection of family members who'd been worried about his absence, crowding around him as he climbed the porch steps and followed him into the house where they belonged. For tonight, at least, they were safe from the lies and schemes of men who saw them as nothing more than inconvenient obstacles. But tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Silas Grant had decisions to make about the future of the family he'd raised, from orphaned cubs into magnificent creatures who deserved better than life as pawns in someone else's game of greed and power. 3 days after Morrison's arrest, Silas found the map exactly where he remembered it, tucked between the pages of Sarah's grandmother's Bible, drawn on heavy paper that had yellowed with age, but remained perfectly legible. The trails marked in fading ink showed a network of paths through the high country, routes used by Native Americans for centuries before white settlers arrived with their roads and railroads and rigid ideas about land ownership. According to the map, there was a pass through the Bridger Mountains that led to a remote valley on the far side of the range, protected wilderness where no mining company could follow and no hunters would be permitted to pursue his bears. It was sanctuary, in the truest sense, a place where bear, honey, and buck could live as nature intended without the constant threat of human interference. The journey would be treacherous, especially in winter conditions. The trail climbed through terrain that challenged experienced mountaineers, crossing exposed ridges where the wind could knock a man flat, and descending through passages so narrow that a single misstep could mean death. But it was their only hope for true freedom, the only path that led away from the forces that would destroy them for the sake of profit and fear. Silas spent the next week preparing for a journey he wasn't certain he would survive. At 64, he was still strong and capable, but leading 3 adult grizzly bears through mountain wilderness in December was the kind of undertaking that tested men half his age. The weather was unpredictable, the terrain unforgiving, and the distance far enough that they would need to carry supplies for at least 5 days on the trail. He gathered equipment with the methodical care of someone who understood that forgotten details could mean the difference between life and death. Sleeping bags rated for temperatures well below zero, a backpack frame strong enough to carry food for 4 large mammals, climbing rope and hardware for the steepest sections of the trail. His father's rifle, cleaned and oiled and loaded with ammunition he hoped he wouldn't need to use. The bears sensed the change in his routine and grew restless, following him more closely than usual and showing signs of the anxiety that came from disrupted patterns. Bear, in particular, seemed to understand that something significant was approaching, staying within arm's reach of Silas throughout the day and sleeping pressed against his bed at night like a massive, furry guardian. Doc Henderson arrived on a Friday evening, ostensibly for his regular check on the bears, but clearly responding to some intuition that his old friend was planning something dangerous. He found Silas in the barn, packing supplies into waterproof containers with the focused intensity of a man preparing for war. "Going somewhere?" Doc asked, settling onto a hay bale and watching as Silas tested the weight distribution in his pack. "Might be," Silas replied, not quite ready to admit the full scope of what he was planning. "The Blackstone people came to see me yesterday, offered to buy my practice, relocate me to their headquarters in Denver. When I told them I wasn't interested, they suggested I might want to reconsider my association with certain local ranchers who were harboring dangerous wildlife." Silas's hands stilled on the pack straps. "They threatened you?" "Nothing so crude. Just made it clear that my continued support for your situation might have professional consequences, insurance issues, licensing reviews, that sort of thing. I'm sorry, James. You shouldn't be caught up in this mess because of me." Doc waved away the apology with the gesture of a man who'd made his choice long ago. "I've been friends with the Grant family for 40 years. I'm not about to let some corporate bullies change that now. But Silas, if you're thinking about doing what I think you're thinking about doing, you need to understand the risks. The risks of staying are worse than the risks of leaving," Silas said quietly. "Morrison was just the beginning. They'll find other ways to threaten my bears, other people to pressure into taking action. Eventually, they'll succeed. And if something happens to you on this journey, what happens to Bear, Honey, and Buck then?" It was the question that had kept Silas awake for the past 3 nights, the possibility that haunted every aspect of his planning. If he died on the trail, his bears would be stranded in wilderness they didn't fully understand, without the guidance they depended on for their entire lives. But if he stayed, they would certainly be killed, either by hired hunters or by frightened ranchers who'd been convinced they posed a threat. "At least in the mountains, they'll have a chance," Silas said. "Here, they have none." Martha Wilson's voice called from the direction of the house, and both men turned to see her approaching the barn with quick, worried steps. Her face was pale in the lamplight, and she carried herself with the urgency of someone bearing bad news. "Silas, thank God you're here. I just came from town. Blackstone's people have been asking questions about you, about your property boundaries and mineral rights. But more importantly, they've hired new security men with more experience than Morrison, men who won't make the same mistakes." "What kind of men?" Doc asked. "Professional hunters. Mercenaries, really. The kind who work for corporations when legal methods aren't producing results fast enough." Martha's voice dropped to a whisper. "Tom Miller tried to warn you, but they've been monitoring his radio communications. He thinks they'll move against the bears within the next few days. The timeline Silas had been hoping for collapsed into immediate necessity. He'd planned to spend another week preparing, gathering more supplies and waiting for weather conditions that might favor their chances of survival. But if armed professionals were already in position, delay would only increase the danger to his bears. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Tom thinks maybe 48 hours before they manufacture some excuse to come onto your property." After that, she didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Everyone in the barn understood what corporate-sponsored hunters would do to 3 bears that represented obstacles to millions of dollars in mining profits. Silas looked at his partially packed supplies, calculating what he could carry and what he'd have to leave behind. The journey had just become a desperate flight, rather than a carefully planned relocation, but the fundamental equation remained unchanged. His bear's only hope for survival lay in the protected wilderness beyond the mountains. "I'll help you finish packing," Doc said, rising from the hay bale with the decisive movement of someone who'd made an important decision. "And I'll drive you as far as the trailhead. After that, you'll be on your own. James, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. Some things are more important than professional convenience or personal safety. This is one of them." Martha stepped forward, her librarian's instincts asserting themselves even in crisis. "I'll create a diversion in town. Make sure the security people are focused elsewhere when you leave. And I'll take care of your ranch while you're gone. Make sure nothing happens to the property." The generosity of his friends overwhelmed Silas for a moment, reminding him that even in the darkest times, there were people willing to risk everything for the sake of what was right. He'd spent so much time focusing on the threats to his bears that he'd almost forgotten the allies who stood ready to help. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate but heartfelt. "Both of you. I don't know how to repay." "Just bring yourself back alive," Martha interrupted. "That'll be payment enough." They worked through the night, packing supplies and planning the route with the detailed attention that such a dangerous undertaking demanded. By dawn, everything was ready: food and water for the journey, emergency medical supplies, camping gear designed for the harshest conditions the mountains could offer. The bears seemed to sense that departure was imminent, gathering around Silas with the nervous energy of creatures who understood that their world was about to change in fundamental ways. Bear pressed against his legs with unusual persistence, while Honey and Buck stayed within touching distance, seeking reassurance from the human who'd been their constant companion since puppyhood. As the sun climbed over the eastern peaks, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of gold and rose, Silas Grant took one last look at the ranch that had been his family's home for 3 generations. The house where he'd been born, where he'd brought Sarah as a bride, where he'd mourned her passing and found new purpose in raising 3 orphaned bears. He might never see it again. The journey ahead was fraught with dangers that could claim his life and leave his bears stranded in unfamiliar territory. But love, he'd learned, sometimes required the ultimate sacrifice, and there was no question in his mind that these 3 magnificent creatures deserved every chance he could give them to live free and wild as nature intended. "Come on, family," he said softly, shouldering his pack and checking the rifle one final time. "Time to go home." The trail began where the old logging road ended, marked by a cairn of stones that Sarah's grandfather had built 90 years earlier. Doc Henderson's truck disappeared around the curve with a final flash of taillights, leaving Silas alone with his 3 bears and the weight of mountains that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The first mile was deceptively easy, following a well-defined path through stands of lodgepole, pine, and aspen that created a natural corridor toward the higher elevations. The bears moved with the confident grace of creatures returning to their ancestral element, their massive paws finding purchase on terrain that would challenge most humans. Bear took point as always, his dark head swiveling constantly as he scanned for threats or opportunities. while Honey and Buck flanked Silas like furry bodyguards. By noon, they had climbed 2,000 feet, and the character of the landscape had begun to change. The trees grew smaller and more scattered, giving way to exposed granite and patches of snow that would become more prevalent as they gained altitude. The air was thinner here, each breath requiring conscious effort, and Silas felt the familiar burn in his legs that came from sustained climbing under a heavy pack. The bears seemed unaffected by the elevation, their superior lung capacity and natural conditioning allowing them to maintain a steady pace that Silas struggled to match. More than once, Bear paused and looked back at his human companion with an expression that suggested concern for the slower member of their group. "I'm fine," Silas told him during one such pause, though the words came out breathier than he'd intended. "Just need a minute to catch up." The weather held clear through the afternoon, but Silas kept one eye on the northwestern sky, where thin clouds were beginning to gather. The forecast had called for possible snow overnight, and while a light dusting wouldn't stop their progress, a serious storm could trap them on exposed ridges with no shelter except what they could construct from the limited materials in his pack. They made camp that first night in a sheltered hollow between two granite boulders, a natural windbreak that offered protection from the worst of the mountain weather. Silas set up his small tent while the bears investigated their new surroundings with the thorough attention they brought to any unfamiliar territory. The meal was simple: dried beef and energy bars for Silas, fish and concentrated protein cakes for the bears. But it felt like a victory just to have made it through the first day without incident. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped towards zero, the bears arranged themselves around Silas's tent in a protective circle, their body heat creating a microclimate of warmth that would be crucial for his survival. He could hear them breathing in the darkness, the slow, steady rhythm of large animals at rest, and found comfort in their presence despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The second day brought them above the tree line and into terrain that belonged more to the sky than the earth. The trail, such as it was, became a series of cairns, marking the safest route across fields of broken rock and snow-covered ledges. The bears adapted to the new environment with remarkable agility, their claws providing purchase on surfaces that left Silas scrambling for handholds. It was mid-afternoon when they encountered the first sign that they were being followed. Bear froze suddenly, his massive head raised and turned toward the valley they'd left behind. His ears were forward, his entire posture radiating the kind of alert attention that spoke of immediate danger. Silas followed the bear's gaze and saw them 4 men in camouflage gear making their way up the trail with the purposeful movement of professional hunters. Even at a distance of more than a mile, there was no mistaking their intent or their capability. These weren't local ranchers motivated by fear or misunderstanding. These were killers, hired to eliminate a problem that negotiation and legal pressure had failed to resolve. "Time to go," Silas said quietly, checking the load in his rifle and adjusting his pack for maximum mobility. Fast and quiet. The bears seemed to understand the urgency, falling into the single-file formation that would minimize their visibility against the broken landscape. Bear led them off the established trail and onto a route that followed a narrow ridge toward the next valley, a path that would be invisible to anyone following from below but offered its own deadly risks. The ridge was no more than 6 feet wide in places, with drops of several hundred feet on both sides. Wind swept across the exposed granite with enough force to stagger a man, and patches of ice made every step a calculated risk. But it was their only chance of reaching the high pass before their pursuers closed the distance. For 2 hours, they moved across terrain that belonged in nightmares, each step a conscious act of faith that the rock would hold, and the wind wouldn't choose that moment to gust with deadly force. The bears handled the exposure better than Silas, their lower center of gravity and forepaw traction, giving them advantages he could only envy. The hunters were persistent and skilled, maintaining visual contact despite the difficult terrain and constantly narrowing the gap between predator and prey. Silas could see them clearly now, could make out the scopes on their rifles and the professional efficiency of their movement. Morrison's replacement had clearly learned from his predecessor's mistakes. The first shot came without warning, the crack of a high-powered rifle echoing off the granite walls like thunder. The bullet sparked off a rock face 20 feet to Silas's left, close enough to spray him with stone fragments, but far enough away to suggest that distance and wind were still working in their favor. "Move!" Silas shouted, though the bears were already in motion, their survival instincts overwhelming any loyalty to the slower human in their group. More shots followed, the hunters firing rapidly now that their presence was known. Most went wide, defeated by the range and the swirling winds that plagued the high country, but one bullet came close enough to Honey that Silas heard it whistle past her head. The rage that swept through him was primal and overwhelming, the protective fury of a parent watching someone try to harm his children. He turned and brought his rifle to his shoulder, finding the lead hunter in his scope and placing the crosshairs center mass. The shot was clean and true, dropping the man instantly and sending his companions diving for cover among the rocks. Silas had never killed a human being, had hoped he would never face that necessity, but watching the threat to his bears eliminated filled him with grim satisfaction rather than regret. The remaining hunters would be more cautious now, aware that their quarry was armed and willing to defend himself. But they would also be more determined, knowing that their employer expected results, regardless of the cost in human life. "Come on," Silas called to his bears, who had taken shelter behind a massive boulder. "We can't stay here." The descent into the next valley was a controlled fall down a scree slope that threatened to become an avalanche with every step. Loose rock cascaded around them as they half ran, half slid toward the bottom, their progress marked by a trail of disturbed stone that would make them easy to follow. But speed was more important than stealth now. The pass that would lead them to safety lay at the head of this valley, still hours away through terrain that offered little cover and no easy escape routes. Their only advantage was the bears' superior conditioning and their willingness to take risks that more cautious travelers would avoid. As they reached the valley floor and began the final ascent toward the pass, Silas allowed himself a moment of hope. They were close now, close enough that he could see the notch in the ridgeline that marked their destination. Once through that gap, they would be in protected wilderness where hunters couldn't follow, and corporate security had no authority. But the mountains had one more test in store for them, and as the wind began to pick up and the first snowflakes started to fall, Silas realized that their greatest enemy might not be the men with rifles, but the weather itself. The storm arrived with the sudden violence that characterized weather in the high country, transforming what had been manageable climbing conditions into a white hell of driving snow and hurricane-force winds. Visibility dropped to mere feet, turning the familiar landscape into an alien world where every step could lead to a cliff edge or hidden crevasse. Silas had faced mountain storms before, but never while responsible for 3 bears who depended on him for guidance through terrain they didn't fully understand. The pass was close, he could feel it in the way the wind patterns shifted, but close meant nothing when you couldn't see your own feet. The remaining hunters had closed the distance during the storm, using GPS and professional tracking equipment to maintain pursuit despite conditions that would have stopped amateur enthusiasts. Silas caught glimpses of them through the swirling snow, dark shapes moving with purpose through the white chaos, and knew that the final confrontation was only minutes away. Bear pressed close to Silas's side, his massive form serving as both windbreak and anchor in the howling gale. Honey and Buck flanked them, all 4 creatures huddled together against the fury of the storm. In that moment, species differences seemed meaningless. They were simply family, protecting each other against a hostile world. The shot came from somewhere in the white void, invisible muzzle flash swallowed by the storm. The bullet took Silas high in the left shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees in the snow. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but what terrified him more was the roar that erupted from Bear, not the warning growl of an irritated animal, but the full-throated battle cry of a grizzly defending its family. Bear charged into the storm toward the source of the gunshot, his massive form disappearing into the white darkness like an avenging spirit. The sounds that followed human screams, the crack of breaking bones, the wet silence that meant death, spoke to the lethal efficiency of 800 pounds of enraged predator. Honey and Buck pressed closer to Silas, their warmth helping to counteract the shock that was already setting in from his wound. Blood soaked through his jacket and began to freeze almost instantly, but the bullet had passed through the muscle without hitting bone or major arteries. He would live if he could stay warm long enough for his body to begin the healing process. Bear returned from the white void like a ghost materializing from another world, his dark fur dusted with snow and his eyes still bright with protective fury. He approached Silas carefully, as if sensing that his human was injured, and took up a position that would shield him from the worst of the wind. The storm raged for another hour, during which Silas drifted in and out of consciousness, while his bears maintained their vigil. When he finally struggled back to full awareness, the wind had died to a whisper and the snow had stopped falling. The world around them was transformed, buried under 3 feet of fresh powder that had erased all traces of their passage. And there, directly ahead through a gap in the ridgeline, lay the pass that would lead them to sanctuary. The final ascent was a nightmare of pain and determination, each step sending fire through Silas's wounded shoulder while his bears stayed close enough to catch him if he fell. The altitude made breathing difficult, and blood loss left him dizzy and weak, but the knowledge that safety lay just ahead drove him forward through sheer force of will. They reached the pass just as the sun broke through the storm clouds, illuminating a vista that took what remained of Silas's breath away. Below them stretched a pristine valley, untouched by roads or development, a wilderness sanctuary where wild creatures could live as nature intended. Ancient forests covered the valley floor, broken by meadows and streams that caught the morning light like scattered diamonds. Bear stood beside Silas at the edge of their new world, his massive head raised to catch the scents carried on the wind from below. For the first time since they'd begun their journey, the big bear's posture relaxed, his territorial alertness giving way to something that looked remarkably like peace. "This is it," Silas said quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind that swept through the pass. "This is where you belong." Honey and Buck joined them at the overlook, their eyes wide as they took in the vastness of the protected wilderness that would be their home. Below them, other bears moved through the distant forest, wild grizzlies who had never known human contact, who could teach his adopted children the final lessons they needed to become truly free. The descent into paradise was gentle compared to the trials they'd endured, following game trails that wound through stands of old-growth timber toward the valley floor. With each step away from human civilization, the bears grew more confident, more attuned to the natural rhythms that had governed their species for millennia. Silas made camp that first night beside a stream that ran clear and cold from the glaciers above, watching as his bears explored their new territory with the wonder of children, discovering a playground designed specifically for their needs. Bear found a fallen log, perfect for claw sharpening, while Honey discovered a berry patch that had been missed by the autumn harvest. As the stars emerged in a sky unpolluted by artificial light, Silas sat by his small fire and watched the 3 creatures who had given his life meaning prepare for their first night of true freedom. Tomorrow, he would begin the long journey back to a world that would never again feel quite like home. But tonight belonged to the family he'd raised, the magnificent bears who had taught him that love could take root in the most unlikely circumstances. Bear approached the fire circle one final time, settling beside Silas with the patient dignity that had marked him since cubhood. The big bear's eyes reflected the firelight as he gazed at the human who had saved his life, and then given him something even more precious, the gift of wilderness. In the distance, the roar of a wild grizzly echoed across the valley, a sound both invitation and welcome. Bear's head turned toward the call, his entire body alert with interest and anticipation. The time of choosing had arrived, and Silas knew with quiet certainty which choice his bear would make. "Go on," Silas whispered, reaching out to scratch behind Bear's ears one last time. "Go find out who you really are." 6 months later, Martha Wilson made the pilgrimage that had become her monthly ritual, climbing the winding trail that led to the simple stone cairn, marking the place where Silas Grant had made his final stand. She carried wildflowers from the valley below Indian paintbrush and mountain lupine, and placed them carefully among the stones that had been gathered by friends and neighbors who understood the significance of what had happened here. The official story, as recorded in the county records, was that Silas Grant had died of exposure while attempting to relocate 3 grizzly bears to protected wilderness. The mining company's security team had perished in the same storm, their bodies found weeks later when the snow finally melted. No mention was made of the real circumstances, of corporate conspiracy or hired killers, of an old cowboy's decision to sacrifice everything for the creatures he'd raised as family. But the people who mattered knew the truth. Doc Henderson had testified before the State Wildlife Commission about Silas's work with the bears, transforming public opinion and leading to new protections for the wilderness area where bear, honey, and buck had found their freedom. The mining permits had been revoked, the company's assets frozen pending investigation into illegal activities that included conspiracy and murder. Martha knelt beside the cairn and arranged the flowers with the care of someone tending a beloved grave. The late spring snow was mostly gone from this elevation, revealing the green shoots of new growth that marked another cycle of renewal in the eternal rhythm of the mountains. "I saw them yesterday," she said quietly, speaking to the stones as if Silas could hear her words. "All 3 of them, down in the meadow by the eastern creek. Bear's gotten huge, must be close to 900 pounds now, and honey, you should see her, Silas. She's got 2 cubs of her own, beautiful little ones who look just like she did when you first brought her home." The wind carried her words across the valley, past the protected borders where no development would ever be allowed, toward the wilderness sanctuary that had become a symbol of what could be accomplished when people chose love over profit, preservation over exploitation. Bear had indeed become magnificent, establishing himself as the dominant male in a territory that encompassed nearly 50 square miles of pristine habitat. Wildlife researchers studying the protected area had documented his interactions with other bears, noting his unusual tolerance for humans and his protective instincts toward younger animals that suggested the profound impact of his early upbringing. Honey had found a mate in her 2nd year of freedom, a massive wild male who seemed to appreciate her gentle nature and intelligence. Her cubs, a male and female born just 2 months earlier, showed signs of the same trusting temperament that had characterized their mother since cubhood. Buck, ever the free spirit, had wandered farthest from the valley, establishing a territory in the high country where he'd been spotted by mountain climbers who reported encounters with a remarkably unafraid grizzly who seemed more curious than threatening. "The ranch is doing well," Martha continued, settling more comfortably beside the memorial. "Tom Miller's been looking after it, making sure everything stays just the way you left it. There's talk of turning it into a wildlife education center, a place where people can learn about living alongside wild creatures instead of fearing them." The idea had come from Doc Henderson, who'd grown tired of treating animals injured by human ignorance and prejudice. With Martha's help, he'd written a proposal to establish the Silas Grant Wildlife Center, a facility dedicated to education and rehabilitation that would honor the memory of a man who'd understood that the natural world deserved respect rather than exploitation. Support for the project had come from unexpected sources. The publicity surrounding Silas's story had attracted attention from conservation groups and wealthy donors who saw an opportunity to create something positive from tragedy. Even some of the ranchers who'd initially opposed the bears had contributed to the fund. Their attitudes changed by the revelation of the mining company's deception and the recognition of Silas's sacrifice. As the afternoon wore on and the shadows grew longer, Martha found herself thinking about the night Silas had shown her his bears for the first time, how they'd arranged themselves around his kitchen like oversized pets who'd forgotten they were supposed to be wild. She'd known then that she was witnessing something extraordinary, a bond between species that transcended the usual boundaries of fear and mistrust. "I think you'd be proud of what's growing from what you planted," she said, rising stiffly from her knees and brushing dirt from her pants. "Not just the bears, but the understanding that some things are worth more than money, that some relationships matter more than convenience or safety." The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of Sarah's hair in the wedding photograph that still sat on Silas's kitchen table. The ranch felt peaceful now, no longer haunted by loneliness, but filled instead with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived and a legacy that would endure. As Martha made her way back down the trail toward her car, she heard the sound that had become the valley's evening benediction, the distant roar of a grizzly bear calling across the wilderness to his family. It was Bear's voice, she was certain, deeper now and more resonant than when he'd been a cub crying for his mother in the snow. But there was something else in that sound, something that spoke of contentment and belonging, of a creature who'd found his place in the world through the love and sacrifice of an old cowboy who'd understood that the most important things in life couldn't be bought or sold, only given freely to those who needed them most. The sound followed her all the way to the valley floor, a reminder that in a world increasingly dominated by those who saw nature as an obstacle to be overcome, there were still places where wildness could flourish and love could take root in the most unlikely soil. It was Silas Grant's greatest gift to the world, not just the lives of 3 bears, but the understanding that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe was the willingness of one heart to open itself completely to the needs of another. In the protected wilderness beyond the mountains, where no mining equipment would ever disturb the ancient peace, 3 magnificent bears continued the lives their adoptive father had made possible. They were wild now in ways they'd never been as cubs, but they carried within them the memory of gentle hands and patient love, of a man who'd chosen to see them not as dangerous predators, but as family worthy of any sacrifice. And in the valley where he'd lived and died, Silas Grant's story continued to unfold in the changed hearts of people who'd learned that the true measure of a life wasn't found in what you accumulated, but in what you were willing to give away for the sake of love. It was a lesson written in stone cairns and protected wilderness, in the laughter of children visiting the wildlife center and the contented roars of bears who'd found their way home. Some bonds, Martha knew as she drove away from the mountains, really were deeper than blood. And some choices, no matter how painful, created legacies that would outlast the lives of those who made them, rippling forward through time like waves of grace in a world that desperately needed to remember what love looked like when it chose courage over comfort, sacrifice over safety, and hope over fear.